Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. On today's episode, the History Guy tells two stories of how hurricanes affected history in dramatic ways. First, he tells the story of the ill-fortuned 1715 treasure fleet, meant to rescue Spain from economic distress. Then he tells the story of the Samoan Crisis, when the US and European powers threatened to go to war over the tiny islands of Samoa, and the hurricane that determined Samoa's fate. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
Hurricanes are powerful things. In fact, the word hurricane is derived from a Central American indigenous people's name for the god of evil. Writing in a 2013 edition of the journal Chemical Education, Professor Earl Pearson of Middle Tennessee State University used some fancy math to determine that 2008's Hurricane Ike released some 2.6 million times as much energy as the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. The numbers are hard to figure, but the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates that between 1/3 and 1/2 million people died in Atlantic hurricanes between 1492 and 1994, and more than 1,000 of those died the night of July 31st, 1715, in a disaster that's more remembered for the treasure than for those people. But those people deserve to be remembered.
Spanish treasure fleets sailed from the mid-16th century until nearly the end of the 18th century, carrying the wealth of Spain's New World possessions to the mother country. The system was developed after French corsairs sacked Havana in 1555 and was designed to protect the goods that the Spanish Empire had acquired in its New World colonies from attacks by pirates, privateers, and foreign navies. The system is generally considered to be the first permanent transatlantic trade route in history, and the iconic Spanish galleon was designed to protect these fleets. The amount of treasure that the Spanish Empire plundered from the New World is staggering. Writer Robert Forrest Burgess wrote in his 1975 work, Florida's Golden Galleons, Spain's economy was almost totally dependent on these treasure shipments from the New World. Since she manufactured nothing that was needed by other countries, the wealth she received from her New World colonies merely passed through her economy into the economies of other European nations that sold their goods to Spain to fulfill her needs. Thus, this treasure affected the entire European economy. Burgess continues, nearly 95% of the precious metals backing European monetary systems came from the Spanish treasure fleets. The education site Schmoop notes that so much gold and silver was imported by the Spanish that between the years 1500 and 1660, prices in Europe rose 500%. The system, called the Flota de Indias, or West Indian Treasure Fleet, actually usually consisted of two fleets that would be sent from Spain each year. The Flota de Indias would collect the treasure derived from the Viceroyalty of Nueva España, or Mexico, and the Tierra Firma Armada, meaning roughly armed earth and called the Galleanos, would collect treasure gathered from Peru. Each fleet would usually be accompanied by two warships. The largest flagship was called the Capitana and would be commanded by a general, supported by the second, usually smaller warship, the Almiranta, commanded by an admiral. The fleet would also include smaller patrol vessels, a support ship, and accompanying merchant vessels. The two fleets would leave the ports of Cadiz or Seville, carrying European trade goods for which there were demands in New Spain. Burgess writes, the goods going to the New World were consignments of wine, brandy, olive oil, cloth, ironwork, books, 2 years' supply of officially letter-headed legal paper, and the royal monopoly of 3,999.5 hundredweight of mercury, to be used in the amalgam process for refining gold. The fleets would go south to the Spanish Canary Islands to resupply, and then using the trade winds in the north equatorial current, head west to the West Indies. The flota would then head to the port of Vera Cruz, and the galleones would head south to Cartagena. The flota would not only collect treasure from New Spain, but also treasure from the Orient, collected in the Spanish East Indies and carried across the Pacific by the Manila Galleon, the world's first regular trans-Pacific trade route, to New Spain. The goods would then be carried by mule train from the west coast to the east. The galleones would collect the vast amounts of silver accumulated in the Potosi mines in Colombia, as well as silver from Peru and pearls collected around the island of Margarita. The flota would winter in Veracruz, while the galleones would usually winter in Cartagena. In spring, they would meet in Havana to escort the treasure back to Spain. The 4 warships, 2 capitans, and 2 almirantes carried as many as 200 guns, enough to protect the fleet from pirates and foreign enemies. The combined fleets would leave in spring and sail north, skirting the coast of Florida until they could catch the Gulf Stream north and east of Bermuda and go back east to Spain. The system was effective, but certainly not universally so. Burgess writes, but frequently the fleets failed to reach their destination. The ultimate success or failure of these long voyages depended on the weather. Hurricanes were the worst villains. Throughout the Indies, they destroyed more ships, claimed more lives, and were responsible for the loss of more treasure than all of the pirates or privateers that sailed the 7 seas. Between 1525 and 1825, dozens of Spanish treasure ships were lost in the Florida waters alone. Such was the importance of Spanish gold to the continent that Burgess notes, when one of these fleets was lost, the whole European economic structure felt the effect. For 150 years, the system brought the treasure that funded the crown and the Holy Roman Empire, funding wars across the continent. But over time, the value of the treasure collected and the power of the empire declined. Writing in a 1976 edition of the journal The Americas, Lowell Newton of the University of Louisville writes that, once the greatest maritime power in Western Europe, the Spanish Navy, by the end of the 17th century was a pallid relic of its former self, while the once immense convoy system that had linked the metropolis with the American colonies was badly decayed. The 1715 treasure fleet was uniquely important. The War of Spanish Succession, considered by some historians to be the first real world war between 1701 and 1714, had interrupted the treasure fleets, while at the same time draining Spanish coffers. The maritime history website Maritime Cyprus wrote in 2012, with the end of the War of Spanish Succession in 1714, the Spanish crown was in desperate need of funds. No major shipment of goods from Spain's New World colonies had been undertaken during the war, so a fleet of galleons was organized to visit various ports of call around the Spanish Main to gather both royal and private treasure to be shipped to Cadiz. Since the majority of the goods consisted of silver coins and bullion, the venture was dubbed the Spanish Plata, meaning silver, fleet. Galleon was by this time merely a term of tradition. The top-heavy Spanish galleon, once the height of naval technology, was well outdated. In fact, the capitana of the flota, the Nuestra Senora del Carmen y San Antonio, or Our Lady of Mount Carmel and St. Anthony, had originally been built in England as the 70-gun third-rate ship of the line, HMS Hampton Court. The ship had been captured by the French in 1707 and sold to the Spanish in 1712. The 1715 treasure fleet had actually started all the way back in 1712. At the time peace negotiations were underway, and a seasoned commander, General Juan Esteban de Abilla, was placed in charge of the Flota de Indias, with plans to leave for the New World in April. But the enemy threat didn't go away, so the fleet did not sail until an armistice was agreed upon between Spain, Great Britain, and France in September. Abilla reached Veracruz in December. There, Burgess explains, a series of unfortunate events at Veracruz prevented the fleet's leaving for 2 years and 5 months. The events included damage from weather, but also difficulty selling the goods brought from Spain and getting all the treasure to the correct place after so many years. Another delay came because the King of Spain, Philip V's wife, had died, and he decided to remarry. His 22-year-old prospective bride, Elizabeth of Parma, had demanded that she be provided rare jewels for her wedding, and the king had sent orders to collect the most unique items from the New World, which took time to collect. The numismatist magazine Coin Week explained in 2022, more than 1,200 pieces of rare jewelry from the Americas were being sent to Spain as dowry pieces for Elizabeth. Her request included a heart made of 130 pearls, 14-karat pearl earrings, a pure coral rosary with large-sized beads, and an emerald ring weighing 74 carats. Meanwhile, the Galleones, under the command of General Juan Antonio de Echeverres, had left in July 1713, a year after the flota. They arrived in Cartagena, New Granada, at the end of August, and then went to the Panamanian port of Portobelo in November to collect the treasure from the Viceroyalty of Peru. The Galleones wintered in Portobelo, returned to Cartagena in the spring, and then arrived loaded with treasure in Havana in October. The Cuban port was large and well defended, considered the best place to winter the fleet, which would join with Ubilla in the spring to return to Spain. But Ubilla faced more delays. The fleet was still loading in March when Veracruz was hit by a strong storm, damaging several ships and requiring time for more repairs. Then the fleet struggled with headwinds, and the flagship unexpectedly lost a mast, making the trip to Havana slow, not arriving until June. Newton writes it was impossible for Ubia or the viceroy to anticipate the dismasting of the flagship, the headwinds that slowed the voyage to Havana, and the subsequent delay in that port while repairs were made to Ubia's ships. The combined fleet would not be sailing until midsummer. That was a risk. The more they delayed, the more risk that the fleet would run into a hurricane.
Ubia wrote the viceroy that the fleet planned to leave on July 23rd, but for reasons that are not clear, the fleet didn't leave until a day later, on July 24th.
The combined fleet included 12 vessels, 5 ships of the flota under the command of General Ubia, and 6 vessels of the galleonist fleet under the command of Echeverres. The last vessel was a coincidence. The French warship Le Griffin, under the command of Captain Antonia Dari, had acquired a license to trade, but when the viceroy had originally set the date of departure in March, by law the ports were closed to foreign vessels to leave. This was to prevent a foreign ship from reporting the fleet's departure date. Dari had little choice. He could go with the fleet or leave after them. He chose to accompany the fleet. The fleet was loaded with an enormous amount of treasure, an estimated 14 million pesos worth, but also with people. Some 2,500 crowded the ships. Burgess gives an example of the crowding. On General Echeverres' Capitana, the largest ship in the fleet, the gun deck was 160 feet long and less than 40 feet wide. More than 450 persons were relegated to this cramped, dark, damp space. The fleet did not take the shortest route to Florida, instead sticking to the coast, safest in a time when navigation was still uncertain. Burgess writes, if either commander had any foreboding of doom in those final days of July as the fleet pushed on through the treacherous Florida Straits under threatening skies, he undoubtedly kept his fears to himself. But the prelude was over. It was the beginning of the end. The maritime salvage site Mel Fisher's Treasures writes, by noon on July 29th, the fleet was almost becalmed. The sea was running heavy and strangely silent swell, but there was no wind. The clouds were the merest wisp of cirrus way down on the starboard beam, and even the seabirds, which usually swarmed around the ships a mere 20 miles from the shore, had vanished.
By then it was already clear that a storm was coming, but there was little that Ubia could do.
The U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Hurricane Research Division writes, Ubia found himself trapped between the uninhabited, reef-strewn Florida shore to the west and the shallow English pirate-strewn Bahama bank to his east, and had no choice but to try to clear the channel before the worst of the storm struck. It was a race he lost, and the hurricane overtook the fleet just as it emerged from the channel. The fleet started feeling the storm on the 28th. Burgess writes, gradually the wind picked up out of the northeast. The ships leaned into the steepening waves, but their northward movement was slow and awkward. The following day, the fleet was pounded by gales. Burgess continues, with the storm's first powerful blast, the ship staggered and heeled over sharply. Sheets of spray blanketed the bows, spurted from around the closed gun ports, hawse holes and scuppers to race wildly across the decks. The ships no longer obeyed their helms, but were forced around in the wind. And finally, he writes, at 2 a.m. Wednesday, July 31st, the hurricane struck with all its fury, roaring out of the east with winds in excess of 75 miles per hour. Nothing withstood its wrath. Fisher writes, by nightfall, the wind, not the captain's, was in full command. It was gusting now to over 100 knots. Ubia lost his mizzenmast, and the fleet was wildly scattered, and the noise was deafening, but above the screaming winds was another more awesome and frightening sound. The breakers on the reefs which lined the Florida coast. On all the Spanish ships' men prayed as they wrestled to try to cut lifeboats free from the debris littering the decks. All were now resigned to shipwreck, and the priests piping Hail Marys made little or no impression on either their flocks or the elements. Ubia's flagship was among the first to be destroyed. Fisher continues, dismasted, her rudder carried away, she could make not even the vestige of a fight. She struck at 2:30 on the morning of July 31st. The reef ripped the bottom right out of her. Then her superstructure parted from her hull, and the poop and afterdeck were cast up on a 50-foot wave. She was tossed around for a few seconds, just long enough for Ubia and 223 of his crew to be washed off and pounded to death on the rocks. Burgess said of the ship, the 471-ton vessel struck bottom with such force that her entire lower hull was sheared away. Ballast, cargo, cannon, passengers, and 120 tons of registered silver coins and boxes plummeted to the bottom of the rampaging sea. With the ship went the jewels for the Queen's dowry, stored in Ubia's own cabin. She would never see them. One by one, the ships were dashed upon the rocks. A survivor reported, the seas became very giant in size. The wind continued blowing us toward shore, pushing us into shallow water. It soon happened that we were unable to use any sail at all, and we were at the mercy of the wind and water, always driven closer to shore, having then lost all our masts. All the ships were wrecked on the shore. Fisher writes the storeships were all caught on the rocks. Echever's war galleon broke up, drowning him and 124 of his crew. His son, who commanded his storeship, met a similar fate. The lighter ships capsized and sank in the surf. Burgess concludes in a few short hours the hurricane took a terrible toll on the Spanish treasure fleet of 1715. The wrecks spread across some 40 miles of beach. Newton notes the nature of the tragedy. The hurricane of late July was unusually early, a fact that underscores the irony of the flota's destruction. If the fleet had left Havana on the 23rd of July, as Ubia had said it would, instead of the following day, or for that matter, if it had sailed from Veracruz a few days earlier, the disaster probably would have been avoided. Still, he writes, the reaction of the survivors might surprise people today. Writing to Viceroy Alan Castor from Havana on October 15th, one survivor attributed the loss to being God's punishment for our sins. An unidentified official wrote the Bishop of Havana that, in his opinion, these things are alone contingent upon the will of God. Another survivor, Admiral Francisco Salmon, informed Al Castor that these accidents rest upon the will of God. It seems odd that they didn't blame Ubia or the leadership whose actions had delayed the voyage. Newton writes, these mariners knew they had no control over the weather, and what they could not control or foresee belonged quite naturally to God's providence.
Of the 12 ships of the fleet, 11 were lost. But Dari had outpaced the heavily laden treasure ships. He never even saw the storm. Only Le Griffin made it back home. Estimates are that between 1,000 and 1,500 people were killed in the disaster, putting it roughly on par with the sinking of the Titanic some 2 centuries later. Some survivors suggest that many of those people might have initially made it to shore only to be washed back out by the powerful surf. For the survivors, they were left exposed to the elements with few supplies. They were forced to use a salvaged lifeboat to seek help from the nearest Spanish settlement, St. Augustine, some 120 miles away. For the next 10 years, the Spanish braved the heat, the mosquitoes, attacked by pirates, and the constant threat of more storms in order to recover what they could of the lost treasure, eventually claiming that they'd recovered 80% of what was lost, although that might have been overstated in order to deter more treasure hunters. But then the location of the site was forgotten, lost, until archaeological discoveries in the 1950s. And in 1959, the discovery of an 18th century map that showed treasure hunters to what has been called Florida's Treasure Coast. Since then, millions of dollars of treasure from the 1715 treasure fleet has been recovered.
Hurricanes are, of course, still deadly today, but the loss of life at sea has been greatly reduced as systems of tracking storms have improved. But in 1715, there was no systematic collection of information about hurricanes.
Banding together in a fleet might protect you from pirates, but it can't protect you from the weather. Newton concludes that the risk inherent in it seemed to be accepted by policymakers, passengers, and seamen alike. The loss of the millions of man-hours required to build the ship, the millions of man-hours invested in the mining, smelting, minting, and transportation of the silver and treasure carried by the fleet, and the loss of more than 1,000 lives. That is merely, he says, part of the enormous cost of empire.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. And we'd also like to welcome Betty Jo, my grandma and mother of the history guy, back to the podcast. So this episode, of course, starts with the talking about the treasure fleet system. And it's amazing how Spain was able to do that. I mean, Spain put together an incredible system where they were getting gold from the Philippines and just sailing it all the way to Spain.
It came on the Manila galleon and went to South America. They walked it across or mule trained it across, and they understood the weather. They understood how to defend these ships, but they still were always subject to pirates. But one of the things that's interesting, it's not just interesting really to hear the mechanics of that, how they brought in so much gold that they devalued gold and caused economic collapse throughout Europe because they had so much gold showing up. But also that for all of their plans and everything that they knew and all that they did to understand every piece of this process and defend every piece of this process, along comes a storm and everything sinks. Probably the most important of their treasure ships ever because of the timing of it, and it sinks. And it's really the end of the Spanish Empire. When that happens, they never recover.
And they had that's
so it is. It's one of the things. The best laid plans of mouse and men often go agley. It's actually how the poem reads it, but so this is an example of that. But it is, I mean, it's very interesting. It was interesting to me when doing the research, about how exactly this was all planned. Exactly, I mean, because you have to plan the seasons, you have to plan the weather, and you have to coordinate a lot of stuff, and you're doing that without a phone, without transcontinental communication. That you can get your silver from the Philippines in the Far East, and you can get it to the right spot because you can only take it at certain times of the year, with any hope of getting it back to Spain. It's really
well, and the fact that
story.
Central America was so central to what they were doing, which we figured out that many years later when we built the Panama Canal. But basically, it didn't change. I think that history is really fascinating too. But I want to know what that lady said when she found out that her ship sank.
Yeah, that's it.
She was really a piece of work there, guys.
We got the best jewels from the New World, and we sunk them off of Florida, and those have never been, all the treasure that's been recovered, nothing's been recovered that was clearly from
I wondered about that.
I was asking if we ever got it back.
Yeah, I was wondering about that
I don't
too.
think no one's ever found the giant emerald ring. I wonder if that's going to wash
Gosh, there was some really impressive, some amazing pieces of jewelry in there. And that tells you.
Yeah, but I mean, such a tiny amount given the tons and tons of silver
true.
that was being carried.
That's true.
So this is a good story, and the history guy's only so long. The episodes are so long. So there was a lot of pirate story in here too, because pirates were raiding pirates were raiding the treasure from the start, and then pirates were raiding the salvage operations and all that sort of stuff. But it includes a lot because there's the human drama of the people on board these ships and caught in an early storm, and had they left just a few days earlier, they would have missed the storm entirely.
Well, and the one ship, the last one that went, never saw the storm.
Yeah,
that is really an amazing.
Missed it.
You want to talk about being the lucky dog in that?
Oh, they were.
Yeah, I got home.
They were trying to be safe by staying closer to the shore, and that's what ends up dooming them, and that's an interesting.
It ends up dooming them, yeah. And you have these great captains and these great ships, and then at this point they're dismasted, their rudders ripped off, and they're just hopeless, and they're just there and get beaten to death on the shore. Had to be absolutely horrifying. And for the few that made it ashore, they made it ashore without food, without shelter, and it was. So there's a lot of human drama in this story. So there's this fascinating part about this is how the Spanish Empire was built and how they're moving the treasure. And there's this whimsical, I don't know if that's the right term, but you got this part where, who knows that leaving 2 days makes the difference. And then there's that human drama of being caught in, again, no matter how much you build and how powerful your empire is, Mother Nature comes along and just swats you like this, and that's that. And then there's this event completely dramatically changed the power structure in the world. That it clearly history would have been different were it not for this one storm at this one moment. And so, this is really, it's a compelling story. It's really, just kind of fascinating to see how it fits together.
Well, and it really brings you back internationally to the fact that, can you believe that those four tiny, tiny countries, the Netherlands, Britain, Spain, France, ruled the world because they knew how to sail, and they had and when they had put together these complicated routes and figured out how to do all of this. But seriously, if you think about the strength that those countries had and how they could lose it so easily, it is absolutely amazing to me that that the world was ruled by the oceans.
Yeah, well, it's not fair to say that the hurricane brought down the Spanish Empire, because there was a lot in decline long before the hurricane, and the War of Spanish Succession was part of the reason this was so powerful. But it is to say that this hurricane certainly accelerated the end of what was previously had been the most powerful empire in world history, and it's an absolutely fascinating storyline. And it still all comes down to how small we are in the face of nature, and still today, we can't necessarily predict when hurricanes are coming.
It's incredible.
We know a lot more about them, and we do a lot more, but still lots and lots of people die when hurricanes come, because it's interesting because even the day before, the flight path can go one way or another, so all your warnings are here, and it hits 100 miles north, and it's a huge difference.
Well, you see all of the when they are doing those predictions, they'll have a bunch of lines coming off that's like, these are all the different ways it can go, and it's the complexity of. And
sometimes it doesn't even quite do that.
Right.
And here you have this added bit too, that we are still digging up the treasure. That this is still that this still has value to us. Shows how how powerful that empire was. That we're still pulling their silver out of the ground, and that's worth millions of dollars. People have found it worth it to go there. So it's this is really an interesting, dramatic, compelling story that tells a lot about the power of empire, but it also tells us that everything that we think that we've built can be destroyed quite easily by the capricious events of nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And it all feels, it all feels so very coincidental. Is that when you look at it, that they were supposed to go in 1712, and then they get there, and it's taken it takes all this time for them to get everything together, and you're working with all these cogs, honestly, in a system that's already decayed. Spain is already struggling. It's not as easy for them to get this silver across the Atlantic as it had been decades before. And then all of that comes together. They finally get it all going, and it gets snatched away from them at the last second. And they had gone through such effort to even get this last big haul to Spain, and there wasn't anything left. They couldn't do another big expedition like that and take another 3 years to even imagine getting that silver back across. And of course, it always is ironic that Spain had all of this gold and all of this material wealth, and it never really ended up. They were never on top of everything. Despite all of that, the gold never really brought them the wealth that they thought it would. Because it crashed economies and threw up inflation and did all of this stuff, which ultimately made it so Spain thought that they should be, crazy rich, and they were always struggling much more than they wanted to. And that's a political and an economic.
Yeah, well, this is inflation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're just increasing the money supply, right? The value of gold is in the rarity of gold. But I mean, Spain wasn't building; they weren't making anything that the world needed, and so they were just taking what they could from.
They were just traders.
Yep.
They were just ship people and so forth. Basically, the economy was built on somebody else.
They're like, we can print money, and turns out the printing money is not the solution that some people think it is. I mean, that's essentially what happened to them. But it is an interesting irony that they were so powerful and so wealthy, and they still decline the whole time. Because they have all this gold, and then they become a target, and it becomes more expensive for them to protect their fleets coming across, and they fight all kinds of wars over this and that, and ultimately all
and there's a lot that has to do with decline of the monarchy and all sorts of things.
But all the gold in the world couldn't buy them out of that.
Yeah, it is. It is all. It all. This is a very interesting story of what it means, and a big chunk of that is that this empire was so powerful. At one point, it felt like the whole world was in their hand, and they're literally getting silver from the other side of the earth, and then they fade, and they fade to the point where one storm can essentially bring down the empire.
That was it. There was no coming back after that. And I mean, it's an amazing. They struggled to get that last kind of honestly gasp of getting that silver.
Yeah.
But you wonder what would have changed if they. I mean, one of the things that they were really struggling for was just was money. They needed the money, and that would have made a real difference to Spain at that moment.
Yeah, but I mean, the way that they were getting they weren't getting cash here by productivity. No. They were getting cash here by digging it out of the ground. And not only was that fake in terms of inflation, you're just increasing, but I mean, there's a point where that wasn't. You have to have been doing something more. Yeah. So I mean, if you'd gotten this influx of cash, how much longer would that have been able? Because they would have needed.
They would have needed to spend it almost. I mean, they already had all kinds of debts.
And it was going to cover. That was going to be debts, and then the next year you're like, where's my money?
Yeah, and so you're right. I mean, the truth is that the most it could have done probably is kind of delayed. And that could have changed things. I mean, they could have made a difference. But Spain ultimately, if they were ramming their head against the same wall they'd been hitting all these years, and it hadn't saved them then, and it wasn't going to save them now. But the storm, of course, does throw an unexpected wrench into their idea of what control they had.
An earthquake in Lisbon. I mean, the Portuguese were a massive empire too. An earthquake in Lisbon dramatically, caused the decline of that.
And you wonder, that kind of stuff happened. It happened to Spain. It happened to Portugal. But that could have as easily some kind of big disaster have happened to a different country. It could have, England for the next 100 years after this even longer than that was, at their height, and there could have been disasters that could have.
And that empire was brought down in a different way. But in a lot of ways we remember the British Empire more because it's a lot closer to memory. But I mean, it was and it was huge at one point, 2/5 of the Earth or whatever. But I mean, we just don't remember really the Spanish Empire nearly as much. But there are still, versions of empire today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a little different.
So wonder, are they more vulnerable than we might recognize?
Yeah, right. When all of this stuff comes together, and it might seem like a coincidence that Spain and got into this war of Spanish succession because they had a absolutely crazy inbred dude who couldn't have children, and the fact that it kind of got was all complex with that war was crazy and came together because of the way that Spain and France, those crowns could have been combined, and that's really what the war was about, was trying to stop that from happening, or to make it happen, depending on which side you were on. And all of that came together with the fact that with this, all the Spanish Empire and the need for this money, and this money coming across at the time that it did, all of that comes together. It was so many different things that made history the way it is and the way it was at that moment. And it's you wonder that if maybe one thing like a storm can really impact stuff in ways we don't expect it to, both both in the literal sense and
they're never probably a greater example of your eggs being in a single basket than that particular one. So hopefully
we're a little
the world doesn't sit on that today. That we're but I mean I don't know. And what does that say for anything that we have going on in civilization today? I mean, the things that we're worrying about today, it might be things that are just trivial compared to what would come if we got hit by the right disaster at the right time.
There are things that we count on, linchpins in the economy and in trade and stuff like that we might take for granted, and that could come collapsing down if the right disaster hit. And that you even look at the way that COVID affected the global economy, and that was it's still having impacts in terms of the way that some trade systems and stuff just hasn't recovered, and it's just going to be different. Some of that's just going to be different and won't recover the way it was. That kind of stuff, if you have a disaster at the right moment, and not just something like COVID that was had a lot to do with how we were trying to deal with the pandemic, but something like completely out of our control, like a hurricane, that's can.
Hurricane, earthquake, volcano,
or how about
meteor from outer space?
The ninth largest port in the United States loses a bridge.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It falls down on it. Yeah,
that could make some real significant issue.
It's going to make some difference in some for some people.
I saw people talking about the fact, like, if they can't open that port quickly enough, I mean, those the companies and everybody that uses that port for trade, I mean, they're going to have to move, and that's going to have an impact. But they're not necessarily going to come back when the bridges, when they can open, and that can have some. I mean, that's going to have real significant impacts on people's lives. And
one moment in time, it can significantly impact things, and that is still true, and that's interesting, and that's part of the lesson that we learned with the treasure fleet.
So if you watch or listen to The History Guy and you want to support us, one of the ways that you can do that financially is by joining our Patreon for as little as $1 a month, but you can pay a little more if you'd like to get some various different little perks that we give.
Yeah. I mean, you get videos early and ad-free, ones that we have built-in ads, but also, there's little perks there, all the way up to signed photographs and things like that. You certainly get a bit better access to the History Guy because you've got ways that you can talk to me. But it's also, if you think that what we're doing is worthwhile, if you think that this is cool, it is. I mean, this is our living. Yeah. This is Josh's living. This is my living, and you can support the cause of history quite easily by giving just a little bit a month. To be a patron, and that's a great way to do it. Patreon.com/thehistoryguy. We've been there for a long time, and it's just part of the way that we can keep history from being forgotten.
Next up, the History Guy tells the story of the Samoan Crisis and the hurricane that ended it.
I think it's fair to say that American Samoa, an unincorporated territory of some 77 square miles, is one of the lesser known of the U.S. territorial possessions. Known for its beautiful natural environment and its pristine beaches, it seems an unlikely place for a confrontation, and yet it was over these idyllic islands that the United States and the German Empire nearly went to war 18 years before the United States would declare war on Germany during the Great War. This small group of Pacific islands, thousands of miles away from the capitals of Germany and the United States, became the focal point of colonial machinations that seemed headed towards conflict until Mother Nature intervened. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The earliest recorded human occupation of the Samoan Islands dates to about 3,000 years ago, and the people of these islands had long-standing trade, combat, and cultural connection to other Pacific Island cultures like Fiji and Tonga. The first known non-Polynesian to sight the island was a Dutchman in 1722. They were named the Navigator Islands by a French explorer in 1768. Contact remained limited until 1830, when European missionaries, whalers, and traders began arriving. The first American ship to visit the islands was the Roscoe in 1821. By the mid-19th century, German, British, and American interests had begun to draw lines over control of the island's trade and governance. All had significant political and economic interests in the islands, which became entangled with the dynastic struggles of the ruling lineages of Samoa. The politics of Samoan culture are very complex and deeply tied to the overall culture and structure of Samoan society. But an overview can explain the conflict that would persist through the 19th century. Essentially, there are four paramount chiefly titles, collectively known as the Sons of the Families, that give holders leadership over the royal families of Samoa. In the modern age, all heads of the Samoan state have been one of these four title holders. One person can hold more than one title, and while the titles bestow power and authority over particular regions, they are rarely all held by the same person, leading to civil strife between the families. The senior of the families is Satapua, which largely dominated the leadership position until the 19th century with the arrival of missionaries and European interests. Their primary rival is the Sa Malitoa family. The Samoan indigenous political system was at a disadvantage when it ran into the organized interference of Western nations. The various families frequently fought amongst each other in the 19th century, but from the 1840s, the Royal Navy started openly supporting one side or another. Malitoa became the ascendant family by the 1850s, but not without rivals. Germany found a significant economic resource in copra, the dried meat of coconuts, and German plantations accounted for as much as 70% of commerce in the South Pacific at the time. By the 1860s, the Samoans decided to form a single government that would be centralized in the position of Tawhaiifa, or king, meaning one supported by four, and originally referring to an individual who held all four paramount titles. But even with a single family nominally in charge, disputes broke out between two Malitoa leaders, Laupepa and his uncle, Talavu, over who should be king, which had become a powerful position thanks to recognition by the foreign powers. The British supported Laupepa, and he was the son of the former leader, but the Samoans had a custom of the right of the remaining brother, which gave legitimacy to Talavu. In 1873, a Samoan constitution and national government was put together, a combination of Western institutions with native ones. The kingship, however, was still officially vacant. Struggles between the two families repeatedly boiled over into violence, and numerous native groups sought alliances or even annexation by foreign powers. In 1878, a treaty of peace and friendship between the United States and the Samoan government was concluded, and shortly after, similar treaties were made with Germany and the UK, and Germany and the US established harbors in the islands. Peace was finally obtained when the foreigners chose to support Talavu as king in 1879, but the new king died in 1880. The rest of the century would focus on a dynastic struggle between these two families, with the colonial powers interfering freely throughout. Competition between pretenders, each supported by colonial powers, began what is now called the First Samoan Civil War. Battles were fought across the islands in 1888. The Germans, seeking to secure their position, shelled rebel villages and in 1887 damaged American property. Shelling and burning indiscriminately regardless of American property, the American consul telegraphed Washington. The Germans continued to bombard and intervene against a leader named Mataafe, even after he was declared king on September 8, 1888. Mataafe successfully defeated his rival's army and even ambushed and killed 16 German Marines. Attempting to regain control, the Germans declared martial law over everyone on the islands. In response to Germany's provocations, the U.S. sent 3 ships from the Pacific Squadron to oppose 3 German vessels already there. The U.S. sent the sloop Vandalia, the steamer Trenton, and the gunboat Nipsic to oppose the already present German corvette Olga and the gunboats Eber and Adler. The UK sent HMS Calliope to monitor the situation. All the ships were moored in Apia Harbor. The standoff threatened to become violent, and German and American sailors brawled in the streets of the Samoan capital. An American newspaper advocated the building of a modern navy to reduce Bismarck's armada to a pile of iron filings. Soon, however, nature would see fit to determine the direction of Samoan history. On March 12th, the navigator of the Nipsic noted a peculiar coppery-red sunset. As wind picked up on March 14th, the ship spared steam engines en masse, thinking they might have to fight against winds. Apia Harbor is not a well-protected bay, and it's certainly no place to be caught at anchor in a storm. Robert Louis Stevenson, author of Treasure Island and the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, who spent many years in Samoa, referred to it as the so-called harbor of Apia, and that such a creek in my native coast of Scotland would scarce be dignified with the mark of an anchor in the chart. It has a broad mouth, it's not protected from the surf, and the harbor itself is filled with sharp coral reefs. The sailors on board the ships at harbor knew that a storm was coming. The falling barometer and rising swell of the ocean was usually enough to send ships away for such a precarious harbor, but the captains had something more important keeping them in place: politics. The ships prepared to ride the storm out, dropping more anchors, striking their yards, and hunkering down. Initially, it seemed like the storm would abate quickly, though torrential rain cut visibility to almost nothing. The storm quickly grew beyond everybody's expectations to become one of the worst storms in the history of Samoa. By then, there were 13 ships in the harbor, fighting against a powerful wind that was blowing them directly towards shore. Ocean spray and debris brought visibility down to virtually nothing. Near dawn on March 16th, the Eber capsized and was smashed to pieces with nearly all of her 80 crew. The 1,000-ton Adler was next, tossed fully onto her side on the reef. The captain of the Nipsic decided it was too risky to remain in the harbor and intentionally grounded the ship on a small beach. Admiral Lewis Kimberly, commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Squadron aboard his flagship Trenton, wrote that at times there must have been a foot or more in the spar deck waterways. In the gusts you could not hardly look to windward. The eyes could not bear the pain of the constant beating splatter. The Trenton was beat mercilessly by the storm. Her steering wheel was lost. The rudder broke off and her bowsprit was ripped away. Water poured into the ship through ventilator holes that the crew desperately tried to plug. All of the anchor cables snapped and the boiler fires were extinguished. Half the crew was pumping and bailing while the ship drifted towards a coral reef. Kimberly reportedly inspired the crew, shouting, "If we go down, let us do so, with our flag flying." In the middle of the storm, Kimberly saw something even more remarkable. The large black hull of a ship looming forth in the dim distance, now high up in the crest of some sea and then down so low that only her tops could be seen. It was HMS Calliope attempting to escape the harbor. The ship's captain, Henry Kane, would later say that the storm was the most ticklish position I was ever in. He could see the Vandalia drifting towards him, helpless and free of its anchors. The Olga was swinging dangerously close to his starboard side. He considered beaching the ship, but finally decided that his best option was to try to go full steam ahead and directly into the wind of a full-blown cyclone. In making the passage, the vessel literally stood on end, the water coming in and out of the bows as she dipped, running aft immediately as she rose. I really wondered how the machinery and rudder stood the strain, Kane said. The Calliope was the most modern ship in the harbor, built mostly of steel and with the most powerful engines. The ship powered forward against the storm, making its way little by little. The propeller of the ship continually lifted free from the surf. Kane put two steering gains together, who communicated using a length of hose just to keep the ship on something like a straight course. One lookout recalled that the sight appalled and fascinated me. One moment I was looking out at the reef, which was like an exposed cliff, and at another I saw nothing but a seething cauldron. The Trenton and Calliope passed so close that one of the British ship's yardarms passed over the Trenton's deck. The Trenton's crew let out shouts of support. The American admiral and his men gave us 3 such ringing cheers that they called forth tears from many of our eyes, Kane said. At an average of only 1 knot, Calliope escaped the harbor. Trenton was still in danger, but was possibly saved by Lieutenant Robert M.G. Brown. Brown suggested that the men got up into the ship's rigging, which made a kind of sail and provided enough wind resistance for the ship to steer away from the worst of the reef. While the Vandalia was sunk completely, the Trenton was able to keep its main deck above water. Only 1 crewman died aboard the Trenton. The last American ship, the Vandalia, was grounded beside her. Her captain had been swept off the ship by the sea, and dozens of others died aboard. The last German ship, the Olga, was able to ground itself. At least 147 men died, and more, including men that died aboard the sunken merchant vessels and on shore. Calliope returned 3 days later to find all of the ships in the harbor sunk. The Nipsic, though badly damaged, would be refloated and repaired, and the Olga would also return to service. All the others were considered lost. During the storm, local Samoans fought hard to help save the men trapped aboard the ships. One Samoan chief was given a longbow for leading a rescue boat out to the stranded Trenton. Others were given medals. For his efforts, Kane was cited for nerve and decision, given command of HMS Victory and later promoted to admiral and knighted. After the storm, the New York World wrote that the awful devastation wrought in the harbor of Apia makes our recent quarrel with Germany appear petty and unnatural. The war drums ceased beating, and Germany repudiated the aggressive actions of their local representatives. Without input from Samoa, the three governments made peace in Berlin with the Berlin Act. But continued fighting between factions led to a second Samoan civil war in 1898 and 1899, ultimately leading to the Tripartite Convention of the three colonial powers. Deciding the joint rule had been a failure, Germany, the US, and the UK partitioned the islands. The US gained the eastern islands, while Germany took over the western islands. The UK surrendered rights to Samoa in exchange for a number of other concessions in various colonial matters in the Pacific and Africa. Germany held German Samoa until 1914, when a force of New Zealanders occupied the island at the outset of World War I. New Zealand governed the islands until they were granted independence as Western Samoa in 1962, and since 1997 have been known as the independent state of Samoa. American Samoa remains an unincorporated territory of the United States. The Samoan Crisis was transformative for the United States Navy. The escape of HMS Calliope was due in no small part to the daring of her crew, but it was also a much more modern, steel-hulled vessel, whereas the United States ships were still largely of the sticks and strings variety and outdated. The Nipsic had been rebuilt in 1874, and the Trenton and Vandalia had both been launched in 1876. America had recognized the need to modernize their fleet before the storm, but Robert Louis Stevenson said of the Cyclone that it founded the modern Navy of the United States. The survival of HMS Calliope was an impressive testament to a new kind of Navy, one which led to a revolution in American shipbuilding, especially after Andrew Carnegie agreed to build nickel-steel plating for warships in 1890. 3 modern battleships, USS Indiana, Massachusetts, and Oregon, were authorized in 1890. At the time of the Cyclone, the U.S. had the 12th largest Navy in the world, but by World War I, it was the 3rd largest. The Samoan Crisis was a defining moment in the history of Samoa and in the interests of the United States and Europeans in the Pacific, but it was also, of course, a prime example of the awesome power of nature, and likely to the men in the harbor that night, of the comparative smallness of human ambition.
So I liked putting these two episodes together because, of course, they are tied together by this hurricane. They're also tied together by how so many different things have come together into a part of history that is honestly somewhat or completely almost forgotten. And that...
Well, and there's this literally, here's our mighty fleet. Oopsie daisy.
Here it goes.
Your naval power is quite limited by what the ocean will do to
and that's,
you.
I mean, that's...
This is another really fascinating episode because the story of what's going on in Samoa at the same time, and the way that European powers are exploiting the natural culture of Samoa and, picking sides and then just playing like a pawn. I mean, it's amazing that when this is all done, they said, okay, we'll just fix this. We will go to Berlin and just decide Samoa without involving the Samoans at all. Nobody there. We'll just go. We'll go.
The number of times that has happened, because when you talk about when they when they gave the Sudeten lands to Germany in 1938, the people they didn't invite.
Czechoslovakia was the country they didn't ask.
And so just like that, they're like, oh, we're going to solve this, and they're like, we've brought all together all the interested parties. Someone appears to be missing.
That has happened lots and lots of times, in history, and so this is a great, example of that. And still today, that Samoa is 2 republics today, and under the unincorporated American territory and the Samoan Republic. So there's that fascinating part of it. There's just what's going on and why we had the ships there, and it's even there at the time we were mostly trying to intimidate each other. We weren't paying a whole lot of attention about what was going on the island. We just each had our own candidate for king, and that was all just about trade.
Yeah.
And another one where, there were huge, ripple effects from that. One of the ripple effects being on how the United States built its Navy, which, might have rolled all the way into the 20th century.
It was an absolutely significant, well, it showed us, that the story of the Calliope in this episode is incredible. And it gives us, some idea of how we have improved because every other ship sank, and the Calliope was the only one able to get out because of our modern technology.
Yeah, very narrowly.
Very narrowly.
And it's because they were all rivals at the time, and yet when the Calliope's getting free, everybody's applauding it, and they're happy to do it. And you have to think that these sailors were helping each other.
Yeah.
Regardless of all that was going on. It's also, it's an interesting bit in history when the U.S. and Germany were competing over a Pacific Empire, and that, of course, Germany would lose its Pacific Empire in the wars to come. But I don't know today that we would imagine. Though I guess there are places where South China Sea or where there's competition over places, but this idea that we're fighting over Samoa with the Germans, that's a different era of history, and we kind of see things differently now.
Well, and we were so short-sighted as far as that they shouldn't have been there anyway. The harbor was bad. It was not a good place to be.
They all knew it.
Maybe we were just we really were not looking at the whole picture on this deal.
Well, and the people making decisions aren't the ones that have to drive the boats, right?
Yeah. But that politically, the reason they were there, they knew a storm was coming. They didn't know how bad a storm it was going to be, but they knew the storm was coming and had enough time that they could have moved their ships if they needed to. But they were politically tied there because if only one person leaves or whatever, one side leaves, and that leaves them at a disadvantage. Although maybe it would have been a surprising disadvantage.
Yeah, if you'd left and then they wiped out the other guy's fleet, then you showed up and say,
But of course, everyone's thinking, if we back out of here, they're totally tied in there politically, and so this is a disaster that happened significantly because of these politics in Samoa. Which, of course,
I think that I think at the start we talk about how Samoa is probably the least known of the American territories, and it's interesting to talk about Samoa now, and what the future of Samoa is going to be, and that's all a very interesting bit of history. But who now would have guessed that we were willing to make this risk fighting over Samoa? Yeah. And how many Americans even knew where Samoa was?
Could even point to it on a map. But certainly, I would think that today it would still be pretty difficult.
Or even today, yes.
But at the time,
the Samoans are overrepresented in the U.S. military. They're overrepresented in like the NFL. It's amazing what that small area is able to accomplish. So I think people know that. But how many people know anything about the politics of Samoa or how we operate as an unincorporated U.S. territory? It's really kind of a fascinating idea.
Well, it's the internal politics are really interesting there. These local politics about how they chose who ruled, and these royal families and these titles. That was all really significant, and it is interesting, I think, to kind of talk about their political independence and autonomy that they had. Certainly, of course, the imperial powers were making some dramatic. We were taking advantage of that in ways that we could do that the Samoans couldn't. They couldn't deal with it, but they were dealing with their own internal power struggles, and we were just playing empire.
Rarely does the empire just show up and say we're taking over here. Usually what you do is you go and pick sides, and then you pick apart where you see the fractures in society, and you become.
That's how
it's hard to say how this impacted the future for the Samoan people. What would have happened if there hadn't been the hurricane, what would Samoa be like if the European powers hadn't even decided to involve themselves there? There's counterfactuals that are difficult to explain. History is what history is. But there's so much fascinating in the story, but part of it is that here we are trying to intimidate everybody. And we're trying to prove how tough and strong and powerful we are, mighty. And it only takes one night. It only takes one night to teach us maybe we are not as mighty as we.
It has to be terrifying, but I think that these sailors. I think that sailors know that your ship is not as like this solid fortress as it might sometimes feel because of just how big and powerful the ocean is. But once a storm like this hits, you think about in the last video where you learn that your ship is just matchsticks that you kind of glued together, and
the mighty ship built by the Spanish Empire can just be beaten to pieces,
destroyed.
And that's there's the human drama. This had to be horrible for people that were in these ships drowning, helpless. Some of these ships were just beaten to splinters, against the reefs, and the people just thrown out into that. And it's a terrible way to go. There's a lot of human drama that's involved.
Of course, because of the length, there's a lot of stuff we left out. There's a lot of human drama in this, of how they were trying to help each other and how they were just trying to survive. Because you forget about those political, the reasons why you're in that harbor pretty quickly. Once all you're trying to do is make it to the next minute and try to keep your boat from literally just being smashed to pieces, because it's gonna be awfully difficult for you to get back to shore. And you can't even see. I mean, they're talking about the winds blowing so hard that you can't even look into the rain.
Even sitting in the harbor. Yeah, I mean, it's very small odds you're gonna make it.
Looking at the photos, those ships look so fragile.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
From now
powerful.
Looking at that, they look.
Those are powerful warships at the time. And
at the time, and to us, they look like.
Yeah, those little bits floating up on shore.
And then there's
they do look
and ultimately, the only two of the ships, the Calliope, which makes it out of the harbor, and the one that grounded itself in like the first 5 minutes, are the only two that I think that end up refloating. These were. I mean, ultimately, that's why we decide, okay, we have to deal with this diplomatically, because that was our force. I mean, that just wiped out everything that it would have been rather difficult for any of the players to send a bunch more ships there. And but you do wonder, while we had the ships there, while you have the power, while you're all pointing guns at each other, waiting for someone to bend, that could have turned into a very different. I don't know that we would have fired at each other. I mean, one of the things of that kind of imperialism was it was all about acting like you will, and then not actually. You didn't actually want to get into a war with Germany over.
No one really wanted a war over that.
Yeah. But also, I mean, there've been a lot of times where nobody wanted a war over that, and the war started anyway. So
we had a war anyway. That's true too.
The double dare didn't work in that deal.
Yeah, right. And that's
there again. Mother Nature won.
Yeah, ended it, and. Had that huge impact. Samoa is split the way it is split today because of this storm. And
because of this storm.
We don't know what would have happened, it might have ended up split, just like it is today. We can't know that. Yeah. But certainly this storm is what made those decisions happen.
Yeah, I mean, the storm is just part of the story, and a big part of the story is the Europeans acting like everything was ours, certainly. But there were different legitimate arguments between both sides, and you can argue about what happened with going forward with German Samoa as opposed to American Samoa. I mean, that's all a big chunk of the story too, as well as the story about how Native culture impacted this and how Europeans impacted Native culture. But in the end, a storm comes, and so they meet in Berlin.
Yeah.
That is sometimes history is simply stranger than fiction. If you wrote this story down as a novel, I don't know anybody would believe you.
They would certainly think it was a little wild. Oh, really? That's how it's all gonna. They're really all gonna sit in the harbor, even though they know there's a storm coming. Yes, yes, they are.
That's how okay.
And then we're going to divide it all up in this way.
Yeah, right. That's the.
It's the whole story, top to bottom, is something that's it's just hard to believe that anyone was behaving that way. Yeah. But yet here we are.
Here we are. Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.